and welcome to UC today. My name is Kieran Devlin, and today's session is Unlocking the Hybrid Work Analytics Goldmine. I'm delighted to be joined by Mike Tolliver, Product Management Director at Biopta. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Kieran.
Before we explore exactly why there is such an untapped goldmine in hybrid work analytics, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself, Mike, and your journey with Biopta?
Yeah, no, I do appreciate you having me on. I've been working in the AV UC field for 17-ish years now. I joined Biopta kind of right in the middle of the pandemic, about 3 years ago, and the idea of leveraging this kind of new set of data to for some novel, innovative use cases was really appealing to me. So that's kind of what I've been working on the analytics side of the fence at Biopta. So Biopta, we have monitoring and analytics platform. So if you want to be alerted in real time when things happen, the monitoring side of the fence is really solid for that. But all that data accumulates, and you can kind of get some really interesting use cases, really interesting trends when you look at the data holistically. And that's what I'm primarily focused on the analytics side. And so we do a lot of research into the data. We kind of publish some trends here and there, establish baselines, some benchmarks, and some really interesting correlations and trends with the data. So I'm excited to talk with you and your listeners about it. And yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you, Mike. But before we touch on analytics specifically, I think it's interesting to address the challenges that organizations that abide by hybrid work model are facing in 2024. One of the stats you kindly sent over before recording was that rates of no participation in small group meetings are rising. Another is that average rates of camera enablement in virtual meetings saw their first decline in 2023. These seem like emerging challenges 4 years on from the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, and there's there's a lot that the data can tell us on that. I think it's kind of important to take a step back, and get a 30,000-foot view of what are those challenges, and I like to ask the question of how many organizations, enterprise companies do you know that have really completely figured out hybrid work models that is working perfectly for them, that each team, each employee, set of employees is perfectly content with it, and leadership loves it. And I haven't met one yet. And if you kind of go back to that huge disruption in how we collaborate back in the pandemic, that was a huge spike, a very disruptive event. And the tail for normalization is quite long, right? And we're still in that. We're still trying to figure out, back then we'd always, people use the phrase, what's the new normal? If you want to continue that, we're still trying to figure it out. So I think that's honestly the biggest challenge that organizations are facing right now. And when you look at, hybrid work challenges, they really boil down to hybrid collaboration challenges. Because when I'm doing my heads down work, when employees are doing their heads down work, that hasn't changed that much. Your software engineering team is still going to use their same dev environment. It's when they're using XStudio or Visual Studio or whatever it is, like that hasn't changed. It's how they collaborate with their peers and with other folks in the organization that's changed dramatically. So those are things that I think present the biggest challenges. And that's the thing that, fortunately we have a pretty new and rich set of data to leverage to bridge some of the gaps there.
Perfect. But before we dive into the specifics on the side of thing of analytics, more broadly, what would you say makes hybrid work analytics such an untapped goldmine, to refer to the title of this video?
It's an untapped gold mine in that it's new and it hasn't really been fully developed yet for tried and true use cases. So I think there's huge potential there. But when we talk about new, if you think about in 2019, pre-pandemic, I believe the number is 76% of all meetings were entirely in person. And so that means that 76%, the vast majority of all meetings, produced no data. There was no quantitative element there. And now that's obviously been flipped on its head. And even with, a pretty substantial return to office, we still see the level of data, the number of virtual meetings that are happening stay high. They're not decreasing. And so with those virtual meeting platforms, they produce data, and that data is being produced whether organizations are leveraging it and looking into it or not. It's there. It's your data. It exists. And so the ability to kind of dive into that data to see collaboration trends, communication patterns, networks, silos, inefficiencies, all that kind of stuff. It's there, and we're starting to see some forward-thinking organizations really look into some innovative use cases for that data to improve their meeting culture, to improve things like productivity and efficiency, really things that are really deeply tied to the bottom line of an organization. So that data is there, it's available, but it's untapped because most of the organizations really aren't fully leveraging it just yet.
Well, let's begin with the productivity side. How does collaboration and hybrid work data help boost productivity in a hybrid work environments, would you say?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'll kind of flip it on its head a little bit because there's no magic solution. I can't go press a software button and collaboration automatically improves. But what the data can do, which is really really valuable, is that it can identify barriers to productivity, and those barriers to productivity are there, but they've largely been kind of under the radar for now. So for things like first of all, how many meetings are too many meetings? If I'm spending too much time in meetings, that's already that's a problem. It's a barrier to productivity. There are obviously the technical side of things. If my meeting quality, my connections are low, or the platforms or my endpoints, the infrastructure is down or unavailable, or the first 5 minutes of all meetings are spent trying to say, hey, can you see my video, can you hear my audio? Those are kind of the more technical side of things. Those barriers are available in the data, but it doesn't stop at the technical side. Like the things you referred to that orient to meeting efficiency, like how often are people spending how often are people joining small meetings and never going off mute? Things like that could, colloquially, meetings that could have been an email, things like that. Even, measuring the flip side of collaboration, which is, uninterrupted focus time. If my schedule is such that, I'm in meetings that are, chopped up my day to where I don't have sufficient uninterrupted focus blocks, that's a barrier to productivity. Even things like, identifying silos and, measuring, how many one-on-ones employees have with their managers or their direct reports. Those kind of things are available in the data that can really guide leadership to make informed decisions on how to improve things.
Definitely. Speaking personally, I definitely find myself much more productive when I allocate almost work sprints for those really tasks where you have to be focused. I think is really interesting. The almost the culture around that has developed and will develop over the next few years. I guess moving on to another compelling aspect to hybrid work analytics, which is employee engagement and by extension, employee retention and attrition. Now, this has obviously been quite a hot topic around the Institute of Return to Office, RTO policies. But what can data tell us both on the engagement side and on the retention and attrition side?
Yeah, really good question. And you touched on this at the top too. So I want to kind of circle back to some of the kind of deeper trends that you can look into with this data. And the data, at its rawest level, its lowest level, is very technical in nature. And so we use this data, in order to say, hey, was the packet loss on your video upstream acceptable so that everyone else could see your video feed, successfully. But that same data can be used to say, hey, did Mike turn on his video camera at all during a meeting, right? So you can kind of get to that, next level of kind of insight in here. And same thing for your microphone. So like, Did I join a meeting with 4 or 5 other people and just stay muted the entire time? So we look at those kind of things just as high level trends, just to kind of get a benchmark kind of baseline perspective on things, and we found some interesting trends on those. And it does, and it will kind of uh, you know circle back to how this relates to engagement and attrition. But first we've kind of measured these kind of things for the past few years, just to understand where the trend lines are. And last year when we measured was the first time, at the end of 23, that we saw an actual decline in overall rates of camera enablement. So previously, since the onset of the pandemic, that had been kind of going up, and this was the first time it had gone down. So that on itself doesn't necessarily mean too much, and it wasn't a dramatic decline. But it was a reversal of the trend line. I think that could be more important when we kind of get to the next topic. But the same thing with these rates of no participation, which you'd expect that, you want that really when you're talking about big town hall meetings and large many to one or one to many presentations. You want your folks to be on mute, so it's you don't hear the dogs barking in the background and that kind of stuff. But when we're talking about small group meetings, when it's a handful of people in a team, if folks are not participating in there, then that's likely a sign that maybe they don't need to be in the meeting at all, or maybe the information that meeting could be disseminated in an email or some other asynchronous method, so it doesn't interrupt their schedule. So those rates of no participation for small group meetings, we saw a pretty dramatic increase over the past 2 years. So the 2022 rate, I think, was 4.76%, and that jumped to 7.15 in 23. So we saw a pretty decent increase in that rate. And so, if you look at that as a, kind of a measure of inefficiency or time that could be restored back to employees, that's a pretty significant chunk. And we also, this kind of data is, I think it's, I'm kind of a data nerd, so it's helpful. I like to look at it and kind of understand the trends on, just for themselves. But, when you can correlate them to meaningful outcomes, it becomes even more valuable. And so one of the outcomes that we can look at is retention. So over a sufficient size sample period, what were the kind of the behaviors or the trends of folks that would eventually leave their organization within a 1 year period compared to baseline? And we saw pretty dramatic differences between those two metrics that we just talked about, and there are some others as well, but those two metrics in particular. So the no participation rate that we just talked about for employees that actually would leave your attrition group, that was 9.59%. And that's a pretty substantial jump up from the baseline of 7.15. More than 2 full percentage points for that low of a level is pretty strong. And same thing for camera enablement. The attrition group enabled their cameras at 18.37% compared to baseline of 32.5. And that's almost doubled. So that's a really, really big gap. And so the data doesn't tell us why. It doesn't say why this is happening. The data just tells us what the numbers are. But if you, I think there is a really, really interesting study published by some academic researchers out of Finland that looked at this kind of data both qualitatively and quantitatively, and they found what I think is what could potentially shed some light onto why this discrepancy exists. They found that within an organization, your employees that are less engaged, that maybe are more likely to leave anyway, your lower engagement group of employees actually experienced the negative effects of virtual meetings more strongly than their highly engaged peers. So things like what we at one point called Zoom fatigue, or like virtual meeting fatigue, where I just feel tired afterwards, and that may encourage me to just turn my camera off more so I don't get that camera fatigue. Those kind of effects of virtual meeting were actually more strongly pronounced within the lower engagement group of folk compared to your highly engaged set of employees. And so that was the first thing that I had seen that kind of made a direct line of this type of data to employee engagement. And it does, present the potential opportunity to kind of look at this data, when at sufficient volume, at sufficient scale, to potentially even be a kind of a leading indicator for overall employee engagement. Um, you know, uh, across the company. So there's potential for that. I don't want to get too out ahead of my skis on that, but it's the potential is there, and I think it's really interesting. But the data itself is pretty pretty striking when you look at the differences between your your folks who eventually would leave the company and those who didn't.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think this ties into what the discussion quite nicely is about RTO policies. And I think analytics could be a really useful tool in guiding and informing best practices around RTO policies, what best suits your organization, and your staff. And some of the stats you cited I thought were really interesting about how RTO hasn't reduced the number of virtual meetings. Another one from an 18-week sample in late 2023, roughly half of all collaboration spaces in offices sat empty for 90% of business hours. I think this is a really interesting topic. How can data inform best practices about how to leverage RTO effectively?
Yeah, really good question, and that's timely, as a lot of our customer base is asking this same question right now because they're trying to figure out what the best RTO schedule is, what the best set of policies are, and I think using collaboration data from your office endpoints, so I can directly measure how often your spaces are being used, and how they're being used, can inform your decisions, on understanding what the needs of the employee base are. Because I think that's an important part of this data right now. When we look at office utilization, historically we've looked at this kind of data for office utilization through the lens of real estate optimization, and that's still a really, really strong and valid use case, especially now with different needs on real estate footprints, right? And so right sizing your real estate spend is really strong, but now, especially with hybrid workforce, RTO policies, understanding the needs of that employee base when they're in the office is critical for the success of an RTO program. Because if folks coming in for a certain purpose and they can't find a room when they need to find the room, or they're frustrated because they need to join a Zoom meeting and they can't find a quiet place to do that because they're in a open layout, or whatever it is. But using data to understand the needs of that workforce, so you can not just make the right hybrid schedule of saying Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, or whatever it is, but make sure when people are in the office, their needs are being met. I think is really critical, and the data can really, really be helpful with that. Down to the minute utilization of every space in your organization, in each office space, broken down by floor, broken down by room type, whether it's a large conference room or a small focus room, things like that. Is that really can be the difference between a successful RTO program and an unsuccessful one, is making sure the needs of your employees are met. If I when we talk about the shape of the office, that's changed pretty dramatically than in modern times right now compared to what it once was. And most of the organizations that I'm talking to, they're rethinking the office as a hub for collaboration. So it's no longer the place where everybody does everything. Like, I'm going to be in the office 5 days a week. I'm going to do my heads down work there. I'm going to do my meetings there. It's a hub for collaboration. So a lot of my, heads down work, my focus work can be done at home. When I'm in the office, I'm there to meet with you, Kieran. I'm there to have a little whiteboard session with my peers and make the most of the collaboration sense. So that's a different set of needs from that physical space, that the space, the layout itself has to support, and also the technology that's put in it also has to support. I need if I need a quiet place to have join a remote meeting, then I need to be able to do that, whether it's at my hotel leasing desk, or if it's at a small focus room somewhere else. And that's I think an important element of there that you touched on. We ran some data from 18 weeks in 2023 and saw, roughly half of all those spaces in an office building were sitting empty for 90% of the time. And when they were utilized, 40% of the time that they were utilized in terms of hours, they're utilized by a single occupant. And so that tells you that, hey, folks probably aren't just going to conference rooms to camp out and sit and have fun in there. They're going, they're trying to find a place where they can have the same expectations of privacy and quietness and lack of interruptions that they're used to at home. And so if I need to join my team's meeting, I don't want to do it from a noisy open area desk and that kind of stuff. So that's the kind of things that you can learn from the data. And a lot of our customer base is doing that exact same thing. And they're looking at this kind of data and saying, we're seeing the fastest rate of deployment of single occupant or two occupant focus rooms in within our customer base for exactly that reason. That's a result of looking at this data, understanding what the needs of the employees are, and then orienting your infrastructure to meet those needs instead of the other way around. Because you don't want to say, "Hey, this is why we built it. You have to use it this way." We want to understand what the demand is, so we can meet that demand.
Fantastic. And you alluded to the sort of the now malleable nature of office space and office space utilization. I wonder if we can explore that in a bit more detail. How does data help companies maximize office utilization? Now it's become such a strange idea. We're seeing so many organizations either downsize their office or get rid of their office space altogether. It's such an interesting topic. How does data help companies almost come to decisions and really guide that decision making processes around office space?
Yeah, really good question. So, yeah, I think it's helpful to kind of turn back the clock a little bit. I've seen what did organizations used to do in order to measure this and understand the problem, and for a long time, understanding space utilization was literally somebody standing outside of a set of office collaboration rooms with a clipboard and writing down manually marking occupancy trends. So that was something that happened. And in addition to that, looking at calendar schedules. So I can look through my Exchange or Office 365 or Google Calendar to kind of understand how often each space was booked, and that's a good proxy for utilization. But we see a pretty big difference between what's booked and what's actually utilized, and so leveraging data from actual utilization, and so that utilization data can come from a few different ways. So if you have a Zoom room or a Teams room or a Cisco endpoint in those spaces for the purpose of virtual meetings, then you can measure how often they were in virtual meetings to understand utilization. But a lot of those endpoints also, have occupancy detection capabilities, and they have people count detection capabilities. So whether someone's in a virtual meeting or not, you can use data from that technology to understand when was the room occupied at all. How often was it occupied by, two or three or four or more people? And so you can start to make more informed decisions on, your real estate investment in that case. You can look through data over time and say, hey, this room has a capacity of 15 people, but over the last 6 months, I've never seen more than 8 go into it. So maybe we can, look at this one space and split it into 2 smaller huddle spaces or medium-sized conference rooms and double the amount of availability for our employee base to utilize. So those are the kind of decisions you can make with that granularity of detail on data. And you can also look at how they're being used. Are my employees going in there and always utilizing the video system? Or is it really popular space because it has a nice whiteboard and people are just, an analog whiteboard where people are walking in and, and having, for the most part, people only meetings that are not facilitated by technology. But you can understand those trends to help you make informed decisions on what the space footprint should be, how many spaces should there be in there, and also what technology should you put in the space to meet the needs of your employees. So that's all the more important now because, like you said, the use cases of the office space has really shaken up compared to what it was before, and the using data to make those informed decisions can be really impactful for your employee productivity and for efficiency, and also for making a magnet, right? Making a place where people want to come. So if I as an employee think that I may not be able to get what I need from the office, I know that every Wednesday at 10 a.m. all the spaces are booked, so I'm not going to be able to find a place to meet, so I'm just going to stay home today. Those are the kind of decisions that factor in on hybrid workforce now, and if you understand where those barriers are with data, you can remove those barriers and make a more inviting place for your workforce to join.
One final question before I let you go, Mike. I'm really curious if we could zero in on a very specific Viopta solution, which is its Space Insights module. Can you please tell us about that and how it supports organizations in maximizing office space, like we alluded to earlier?
Yeah, really good question. And yeah, Space Insights is a module specifically for basically what we've been talking about in Viopta. So it's taking the collaboration data and orienting it around the physical spaces that you have in each office, and you can will automatically tag each space as being in a certain office, being in a certain city, being in a certain country. So at a really high level, you can break your data down into actionable levels, and you can see all the things that we talked about. It's kind of an off the shelf solution for these set of use cases. So if you wanted to understand, how often rooms are being booked but not being utilized, you can do that. You can often see which even to the level of which set of recurring meetings tend to not get actually attended over time. So it's a very granular, actionable level of data. So you can compare, occupancy rates, compare those to capacity rates of rooms. You can look at which schedule-based data. So if you have a hybrid schedule of Tuesdays or Thursdays, you really want to look at those days to find if there are any bottlenecks to where you don't have sufficient amount of spaces. It's a tool that we have that's leveraging all this collaboration data from a multi-platform, vendor agnostic perspective, and providing a single pane of glass for for decision makers to optimize their real estate spend. So a lot of times the folks that are really driving this, the usage of this platform are either on the real estate side or facilities management side, because they're the ones that are largely making decisions. So you can make you can optimize your real estate spend, but you can also from an AV and UC perspective understand exactly how those spaces are being utilized, how the technology in those spaces are being utilized, and make really informed decisions on how to outfit those spaces, how to make the right capacity in those spaces to really meet the needs of your employees while you're in the office. So we're seeing a huge increase in interest in the Space Insights module in the past year or so, as more and more folks are really truly struggling with their RTO programs and looking for some data that can really help with that.
Grand. Well, I think that's a really optimistic way to end this conversation, as we almost brought everything together on all the myriad ways that a hybrid work analytics can be spread, but on the level of insights and recommendations that can be extrapolated from them. But thank you, Mike, for being here. I've really enjoyed this session.
Thank you, Kieran. Really appreciate you having me.
And if you enjoyed this video, please give us a like and share on social media, and we'll see you next time. I've been Kieran Devlin of UC Today. Thanks for watching.